On October 16, 1859, abolitionist John Brown led a small army of 18 men on a raid against the Federal Armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, in an attempt to start an armed slave revolt and destroy the institution of slavery. He had no rationale, he had no escape route, his plan was doomed from the very beginning, but it did succeed to deepen the divide between the North and South. John Brown and his men marched into an unsuspecting Harper's Ferry and seized the Federal complex with little resistance. He then set out into the country to free slaves, collect several hostages, and then he sat down to wait. Troops under the command of Lieutenant Robert E. Lee arrived from Washington to arrest Brown. They stormed the engine house, captured him and members of his group, and turned them over to Virginia authorities to be tried for treason. He was quickly tried and sentenced to hang on December 2, 1859. John Brown's fanaticism affected many of the people around him, especially his family. Two of his sons were killed at Harper's Ferry, and the South put a negative condensation on the name of John Brown, which also affected those around him. In the North, his raid was greeted by many with widespread admiration. They recognized the raid itself was the act of a madman. Some Northerners admired his bravery and courage, seeing him as a true patriot. Once John Brown became formally indicted and sentenced to his execution, he created his final speech known as the Address of John Brown, Sentenced to Death, in which he stated his true intentions of committing this crime, his true feelings about the result of the court hearing, and to voice his supposed justification for his actions. It was on November 2nd when the judge asked Brown if he had anything he wanted to say. Brown rose from the cot on which he had been lying the entire trial due to injuries sustained at Harper's Ferry, and addressed the court. Brown denied having committed any crimes aside from wanting to free the slaves. He stated that he never intended to murder, to commit treason, or to incite slaves into a rebellion. However, having had committed murder, Brown did not appear remorseful of that fact. His only goal was to free the slaves as God wanted him to do. He seemed resigned, saying, "If it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." Brown spoke a couple more words to the court and then resumed his position on the cot. Some people, predominantly Northern abolitionists, saw John Brown as a true patriot and not the man he was depicted in Southern media, a fiery, violent, wide-eyed radical. Throughout John Brown's entire final speech, he used a fair-minded rationale to comprehend that what he did was illegal in the eyes of the law. But in the law of God, he was just fighting for a cause and accepts any punishment that would come his way. With his feeling of self-achievement, he stated, "I feel no conscience of guilt." He also uses the law of God to support his argument by pointing towards excerpts from the New Testament, which is where you'll find most anti-slavery or anti-social caste arguments. In his final speech, he references the New Testament by providing a statement that provides over modern Catholicism. He stated, "The New Testament teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them." The most patriotic part of John Brown's final speech was the dignity and moral superiority he assumed behind his actions, in which he said, "I never had any design against the life of any person, nor any disposition to commit treason, or excite slaves to rebel, or make any general insurrection. I never encouraged any man to do so, but always discouraged any idea of that kind." Throughout this speech, John Brown is very influential in convincing the world that he is truly the patriot that many Northern abolitionists thought he was. Another question is if he wrote this with a strong bias, since he knew that there was nearly a 100% chance of him being executed prior to the writing of this speech. There was no reason for him to conceal the cause and rationale for going about freeing the slaves and raising awareness through civil disobedience. More importantly, the letter regarding the situation that he wrote to his wife voiced his true feelings of the situation and were almost identical to the rationale behind his final speech. In this letter, he references God and his lack of a guilty conscience that is synonymously characterized in paragraphs 3 and 4 of his final speech. In this letter to his wife, he says, "Under all these terrible calamities, I feel quite cheerful in the assurance that God reigns and will overrule all for his glory and best possible good. I feel no conscience of guilt in the matter, nor even mortification on account of my imprisonment in irons, I feel perfectly sure that very soon no member of my family will feel any possible disposition to blush on my account. He might have been acting irrationally in the way that he approached his actions. However, his use of civil disobedience to widen the divide between the North and South created a long-lasting effect in his intentions, which inevitably led up to the Civil War. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. This excerpt from John Brown's speech shows his radical commitment to freeing the slaves that he deemed to be just. Some blamed him for being a radical terrorist, based on the fact that the ends don't justify the means, in context of innocent people being killed compared to innocent lives saved from lifelong oppression. He justifies his radical actions on the clause that he is working in line with God. But this didn't prevent people from pointing to things such as the Potawatomi massacre, where John Brown led his followers into literally hacking 5 men into pieces, who presumably were for slavery. Yes, their opinions were wrong and horrible, but that doesn't make John Brown's actions justified. Southerners were shocked and outraged. How could anyone be sympathetic to a fanatic who destroyed their property and threatened their very lives? How could they live under a government whose citizens regard John Brown as a martyr? Southern newspapers labeled the entire North as John Brown sympathizers. Southern politicians blamed the Republican Party and falsely claimed that Abraham Lincoln supported Brown's intentions. A month after his closing words on December 2, 1859, Brown was hanged outside of Charlestown, Virginia. Brown left a lasting impression on both the North and the South. Many Southerners saw Brown as a fanatic and one who had threatened their way of life, whereas Northerners viewed Brown as a visionary man who wanted to help the deprived slaves. Even after Brown's execution, his raid on Harper's Ferry stood as the beginning of the end of civil relationships between the North and South, until the end of the Civil War.